remarked that the emperor's labors had not been limited either to Paris or to France, but that almost every town in Italy supplied instances of his creative powers. Everywhere one traveled, at the foot as well as on the top of the Alps, on the sands of Holland, on the banks of the Rhine, Always Napoleon wants to be seen. In consequence of this remark, he observed that he had determined on draining the Pontine marshes. Caesar, he said, was about to undertake it when he perished and returning to France. The kings, he said, had too many country houses and useless objects. Any impartial historians will be justified in blaming Louis XIV for his excessive and idle expenditure at Versailles. Involved as he was in wars, taxes, and calamities, he exhausted himself for the purpose of forming, after all, but a bastard town. The emperor that analyzed the advantages of an administrative town, that is to say, calculated for the union of the different branches of administration, and they seemed to him truly problematical. I have here great cause to regret that I did not note down the series of those reasons. They were so numerous, so ingenious. At present, I am precluded by the fidelity which is due to my narrative from attempting to throw them into any kind of order. This is, however, a regret which I have unfortunately but too frequent occasions to renew. If numerous breaks are perceived in the emperor's reasoning, and more particularly in the connection of his explanations, it is because at St. Helena I took my notes in a hasty manner and trusted to my memory for the proper understanding and arrangement of them at a seasonable time, or also because I contented myself with abbreviations and hieroglyphic signs. I also knew that I was at the source, but now I find that the meaning has escaped my memory, or that I can no longer trace it in my own signs. This must be my excuse for many omissions. The emperor did not conceal his opinion that the capital was not at times a fit residence for the sovereigns, but in another point of view, Versailles was not suitable to the ministers, and the courtiers. Louis XIV therefore committed a fault if he undertook to build Versailles solely for the residence of kings. When Saint-Germain was in every respect ready for the purpose, nature seemed to have made it expressly for the real residence of the kings of France. Napoleon himself had committed faults in that respect. He ought, for instance, to have given up Compiègne, and he regretted having celebrated his marriage there instead of selecting Fontainebleau. That, said he, in repeating the word Fontainebleau, is a real abode of kings. The house for centuries. It is not, perhaps strictly speaking, an architectural palace, but it is unquestionably well calculated and perfectly suitable. It was certainly the most commodious and the most happily situated in Europe for the sovereign. He then took a review of the capitals he had visited, of the palaces he had seen, and claimed a decided superiority in our favor. Fontainebleau, he further added, was also at the same time the most suitable political and military situation. The emperor approached himself with the sums he had expended on Versailles, but yet it was, he said, necessary to prevent it from falling into ruins. The destruction of a considerable part of that palace was a subject of consideration during the Revolution. It was proposed to take away the middle, and thus to separate the two sides. It would have been of essential service to me, observed, for nothing is so expensive or so truly useless as this multitude of palaces, and if notwithstanding I undertook that of the King of Rome, it was because I had views peculiar to myself, and besides, in reality, I never thought of doing more than preparing the ground. There I should have stopped. My errors in disbursements of this kind could not, after all, be very great. They were, thanks to my budgets, observed and necessarily corrected every year, and could never exceed a small part of the expense occasioned by the original fault. The emperor assured us that he experienced every possible difficulty in making his system of budgets intelligible and in carrying it into execution. Whenever a plan to the amount of 30 millions, which suited me, was proposed, granted, was my answer, but to be wound up in 20 years, that is to say, at 1,500,000 francs a year. So far, all went on very smoothly, but what am I to get, I added, for my first year? For if my expenditure is to be divided into parts, it is, however, my determination to have the result, the work entire and complete, In this manner, I wished at first for a recess, an apartment, no matter what, but something perfect for my 1,500,000 francs. The architects seemed resolved not to comprehend my meaning. It narrowed their expensive views and their grand effects. They would at once have willingly erected a whole facade, which must have remained for a long time useless, and thus involved me in immense disbursements which, if interrupted, would have swallowed up everything. It was in that manner, which was peculiar to myself, and in spite of so many political and military obstacles, that I executed so many undertakings. I added 40 millions to the crown effects, of which 4 millions at least consisted of silver plate. How many palaces have I not repaired? Perhaps too many. I return to that subject. Thanks to my mode of acting, I was enabled to inhabit Fontainebleau within 1 year after the repairs were begun, and it cost me no more than 500,000 or 600,000 francs. If I have since expended 6 millions on it, that was merely the result of 6 years. It would have cost me much more in the course of time. My principal object was to make the expense light and imperceptible, and to give durability to the work. During my visits to Fontainebleau, said the emperor, from 12 to 1,500 persons were invited and lodged with every convenience. Upwards of 3,000 might be entertained at dinner, and this cost the sovereign very little, in consequence of the admirable order and regularity established by Duroc. More than 20 or 25 princes, dignitaries, or ministers were obliged to keep their households there. I disapproved of the building of Versailles, but in my notions respecting Paris, and they were occasionally gigantic, I thought of making it useful and of converting it in the course of time into a kind of Faubourg, an adjacent site, a point of view from the grand capital, and for the purpose of more effectually appropriating it to that end, I had conceived a plan of which I had a description sketched out. It was my intention to expel from its beautiful thickets those nymphs, the productions of a wretched taste, and those ornaments a la Turcaret, and to replace them by panoramas and masonry of all the capitals into which we had entered victorious, and of all the celebrated battles which had rendered our arms illustrious. It would have been a collection of so many eternal monuments of our triumphs and our national glory, placed at the gate of the capital of Europe, which necessarily could not fail of being visited by the rest of the world. Here he suddenly left off and began reading Le Distrait, but he almost instantly laid it aside, whether from the agitation of his own thoughts or from a nervous cough, with which he had for a short time been often affected after dinner. He certainly gets considerably worse, and his health is altogether declining. The 5th, the emperor did not go out until after 5 o'clock. He was in pain, and had taken a bath, where he remained too long, in consequence of the arrival of Sir H. Lowe, as he would not leave it until the governor disappeared. The emperor had read, while in the bath, 2 volumes of the Ottoman history. He had conceived the idea and regretted that he had been unable to execute it, of having all the histories of Europe since Louis XIV composed on the very documents belonging to our foreign affairs, which contain the official reports of all the ambassadors. My reign, he observed, would have been a perfect epic for that object. The superiority of France, its independence and regeneration, enabled the actual government to make such a publication without inconvenience. It would have resembled the publication of ancient history. Nothing could have been more valuable. He next adverted to Sultan Selim III, to whom he said, he once wrote, "Sultan, come forth from thy seraglio, place thyself at the head of thy troops, and renew the glory days of thy monarchy." Selim, the Louis XVI of the Turks, said the emperor, who was very much attached and very favorable to us, contented himself with answering that the advice was excellent for the first princes of his dynasty, but that the manners of those times were very different, and that such a conduct would at present be unseasonable and altogether unproductive. The emperor added, however, that nobody knew how to calculate with certainty the energy of the sudden burst which might be produced by a sultan of Constantinople, who was capable of placing himself at the head of his people, of infusing new spirits into them, and of exciting that fanatical multitude to action. At a later period, he observed that, for his own part, if he had been able to unite the Mamelukes with his French, he should have considered himself the master of the world. With that chosen handful and the rabble, he added with a smile, recruited on the spot to be expended in the hour of need. I know nothing that could have resisted me. Algiers trembled at it. But should your Sultan, said one day, the day of Algiers, to the French consul, ever take it into his head to pay us a visit, what safety could we hope for? For he has defeated the Mamelukes. The Mamelukes, observed the emperor, were in fact objects of veneration and terror throughout the East. They were looked upon as invincible until our time. The emperor, while waiting for dinner in the midst of us, opened a book which laid aside on the couch. It was the Regency. He stigmatized it as one of the most abominable eras of our annals. I was vexed that it had been described with the levity of the age and not with the severity of history. It had been strewn with the flowers of fashionable life and set off with the coloring of the graces, instead of having been treated with exact justice. The Regency, he observed, had been in reality the reign of the depravity of the heart, of the libertinism of the mind, and of the most radical immorality of every species. It was such, he said, that he believed in all the horrors and abominations with which the manners of the regent were reproached in the bosom of his own family, while he did not give credit to the stories told of Louis XV, who, although plunged in the foulest and most frightful debauchery, did not, however, leave any grounds to justify his belief in such shocking and monstrous indulgencies, and he vindicated him very satisfactorily from certain imputations which would have seriously affected the person of one of his Napoleon's former aides-de-camp. He considered the epic of the regent to have been the overthrow of every kind of property, the destruction of public morals. Nothing had been held sacred, either in manners or in principles. The regent was personally overwhelmed with infamy. In the affair of the legitimated princess, he had been guilty of the lowest baseness and of great abuse of authority. The king alone could sanction such a decision, and he, the regent, had felt pleasure in gratuitously dishonoring himself in the person of his wife, the natural daughter of Louis XIV, whom he had found it in his interest, however, to marry while that king was on the throne. The sixth, as we wished to try the tent, which was just finished, the table was laid there, and we invited the English officers who had superintended the work to breakfast with us. The emperor sent for me to his apartment. He dressed himself, and when he went out, I accompanied him to the bottom of the wood, where we walked for some time. He entered into the consideration of some important objects. The emperor returned to the calash for the purpose of ordering it to be in readiness, and we resumed our walk until it took us up. On our return, the emperor visited the tent and said a few words expressive of his satisfaction to the officer and seamen who were employed in putting the last hand to it. The seventh, after breakfasting in the tent, the emperor took a fancy to review some chapters of the campaigns of Italy. He sent for my son, whose foot was at length much better and whose eyes were in an improved state. He finished the chapters of Pavia and Leghorn. He afterwards walked towards the bottom of the wood, having ordered the carriage to fall on the way. The emperor said that he considered the campaigns of Italy and Egypt as completely finished and in a fit state to be given to the public, and it would, no doubt, he remarked, be a very agreeable present to the French and Italians. It was the record of their glory and their rights. He did not think, however, that he ought to put his name to it, and he repeated that the different epics of his memoirs would consecrate those of his faithful companions. On the arrival of the calash, the conversation continuing on the same subject, he was earnestly pressed to finish 1815 and its importance, interest, and results were warmly canvassed. Very well, said he with a smile. I must give myself up to it entirely. It is a pleasure to be encouraged, but it is also requisite to go to work with a proper temper. We are surfeited here with disgust and trickery. We seem to be envied the air we breathe. He returned to his apartment, and I followed him when a conversation peculiarly interesting and remarkable took place. It related to Gustavus III, to Sweden, to Russia, to Gustavus IV, to Bernadotte, to Paul I. I have said that at Aix-la-Chapelle, Gustavus III lived among us as a simple individual under the name of Le Comte de Haga. He constituted the charm of society by the vivacity of his wit and the interest he imparted to his recitals. I had heard from his own mouth his famous Revolution of 1772, and I was in the happiest situation to obtain a thorough knowledge of that epoch of the history of Sweden. I was at that time very well acquainted with Baron de Sprengporten, who, after having displayed great zeal for Gustavus, had the misfortune to go to Russia and return at the head of foreigners to fight against his country. The consequence was that sentence of death had been passed upon him in Sweden. He was also at Aix-la-Chapelle at the moment, and he had banished himself from it out of courtesy, he said, on the arrival of Gustavus. He had not, however, removed farther off than half a league, so that all I heard the king say in the evening was controverted, modified, or confirmed for me the next morning at breakfast by the Baron. He had enjoyed a very considerable share of that prince's confidence, and he communicated the most numerous and minute particulars as positive facts respecting the romance of the birth of Gustavus IV, who had been represented as altogether unconnected by blood with Gustavus III, according to his full knowledge and his own desire. The emperor observed that this same Sprengporten had been actually sent to him as envoy to Paul at the time of his consulate. With respect to Gustavus IV, he said that the prince had, on his appearance in the world, announced himself as a hero and had terminated his career merely as a madman, and that he had distinguished himself in his early days by some very remarkable traits. While yet under age, he was seen to insult Catherine by the refusal of her granddaughter at the moment even when that great empress, seated on her throne and surrounded by her court, waited only for him to celebrate the marriage ceremony. At a later period, he had insulted Alexander in no less marked a manner by refusing, after Paul's catastrophe, one of the new emperor's officers' entrance into his territory, and by answering to the official complaints addressed to him on this subject, that Alexander ought not to be displaced, that he, Gustavus, who still wept for the assassination of his father, should shut the entrance of his states against one of those accused by the public voices of having immolated his father on my accession to the sovereignty, said the emperor. He declared himself my great antagonist. It might have been supposed that nothing short of renewing the exploits of the great Gustavus Adolphus would have satisfied him. He ran over the whole of Germany for the purpose of stirring up enemies against me. At the time of the catastrophe of the Duc d'Enghien, he swore he would exact vengeance in person, and at a later period he insolently sent back the Black Eagle to the King of Prussia because the latter had accepted my Legion of Honor. His fatal moment at length arrived. A conspiracy of no common kind tore him from the throne and transported him out of his states. The unanimity evinced against him is no doubt a proof of the wrongs he had committed. I am ready to admit that he was inexcusable and even mad, but it is notwithstanding extraordinary and unexampled that in that crisis a single word was not drawn in his defense, whether from affection, from gratitude, from virtuous feeling, or even from mere simplicity, if it must be so. And truly it is a circumstance which does little honor to the atmosphere of kings. This prince, tossed about and deceived by the English, who wished to make him their instrument, and repulsed by his relatives, seemed determined to renounce the world, and as if he had felt his existence disgraced by his contempt of mankind and his disgust at things, he voluntarily lost himself altogether in the crowd. The emperor said that after the Battle of Leipzig, he had been informed on the part of Gustavus that he had no doubt been his enemy a long time, but that for a long time he, Napoleon, was of all others the sovereign of whom he had the least to complain, and that for a long time also his only sentiments with regard to him were those of admiration and sympathy, that his actual misfortunes permitted him to express his feelings without restraint, that he offered to be his aide-de-camp and requested an asylum in France. I was affected, observed the emperor, But I soon reflected that if I received him, my dignity would be pledged to make exertions in his favor. Besides, I no longer ruled the world. And then common minds would not fail to discover in the interest I took for him an impotent hatred against Bernadotte. Finally, Gustavus had been dethroned by the voice of the people, and it was the voice of the people by which I had been elevated. In taking up his cause, I should have been guilty of inconsistency in my own conduct and have acted upon discordant principles. In short, I dreaded lest I should render affairs more complicated than they were and silenced my feelings of generosity. I caused him to be answered that I appreciated what he offered me and that I was sensible of it, but the political interest of France did not allow me to indulge in my private feelings, and that it even imposed upon me the painful task of refusing for the moment the asylum which he asked, that he would, however, greatly deceive himself if he supposed me to entertain any other sentiments than those of extreme goodwill and sincere wishes for his happiness. Some time after the expulsion of Gustavus, while the succession to the throne was vacant, the Swedes, desirous of recommending themselves to me in securing the protection of France, asked me to give them a king. My attention was for an instant turned to the viceroy, but it would have been necessary for him to change his religion, which I deemed beneath my dignity and that of all those who belonged to me. Besides, I did not think the political results sufficiently important to excuse an action so contrary to our manners. I attached, however, so much value to the idea of seeing the throne of Sweden in possession of a Frenchman. It was in my situation a puerile sentiment. The real king, according to my political system and the true interests of France, was the king of Denmark, because I should then have governed Sweden by the influence of my simple contact with the Danish provinces. Bernadotte was elected, and he was indebted for his elevation to his wife, the sister-in-law of my brother Joseph, who then reigned at Madrid. Bernadotte affected great dependence on me, came to ask for my approbation, protesting with too visible an anxiety that he would not accept the crown unless it was agreeable to me. I, the elected monarch of the people, had to answer that I could not set myself against the elections of other people. It was what I told Bernadotte, whose whole attitude betrayed the anxiety. Excited by the expectation of my answer, I added that he had only to take advantage of the goodwill of which he had been the object, that I wished to be considered as having no weight in his election, but that it had my approbation and my best wishes. I felt, however, shall I say it, a secret instinct which made the thing disagreeable and painful. Bernadotte was, in fact, the serpent which I nourished in my bosom. He had scarcely left us when he clung to the system of our enemies, and we were obliged to watch and dread him. At a later period, he was one of the great active causes of our calamities. It was he who gave to our enemies the key of our political system and communicated the tactics of our armies. It was he who pointed out to them the way to the sacred soil. In vain would he excuse himself by saying that in accepting the crown of Sweden, he was henceforth bound to be a Swede only. Pitiful excuse, valid only with those of the populace and the vulgar that are ambitious. In taking a wife, one does not renounce his mother. Still less is he bound to transfix her bosom and tear out her entrails. It is said that he afterwards repented. That is to say, when it was no longer time, and when the mischief was done. The fact is that in finding himself once more among us, he perceived that opinion exacted justice of him. He felt himself struck with death. Then the film fell from his eyes, for it is not known to what dreams his presumption, his vanity, might have incited in him in his blindness. And at the end of this, and many other things besides, I presume to observe to him, as a very fantastical and extraordinary matter of chance, that the soldier Bernadotte, elevated to a crown for which Protestantism was a necessary qualification, was actually born a Protestant, and that his son, destined on that account to reign over the Scandinavians, presented himself in the midst of them precisely with the national name of Oscar. My dear Las, replied the emperor, it is because that chance so often cited, of which the ancients made a deity which astonishes us every day and strikes us every instant, does not after all appear so singular, so capricious, so extraordinary, but in consequence of our ignorance of the secret and altogether natural causes by which it is produced. And yet this single combination is sufficient to create the marvelous and give birth to mysteries. Here, for instance, with respect to the first point, that of having been born of a Protestant, let not the honor of that circumstance be assigned to chance. Blot that out. With regard to the second, the name of Oscar, it was I who was his godfather. And when I gave him the name, I was raving mad with Ossian. It presented itself, of course, very naturally. You now see how simple that is, which so greatly astonished you. At the end of this conversation, the emperor returned to Paul. He talked of the passionate fits brought upon him by the perfidy of the English ministry. He had been promised Malta the moment it was taken possession of, and accordingly he was in great haste to get himself nominated Grand Master. Malta reduced. The English ministers denied that they had promised it to him. It is confidently stated that on the reading of this shameful falsehood, Paul felt so indignant that, seizing the dispatch in full counsel, he ran his sword through it and ordered it to be sent back in that condition by way of answer. If it be folly, said the emperor, it must be allowed that it is the folly of a noble soul. It is the indignation of virtue which was incapable until then of suspecting such baseness. At the same time, the English ministers treating with us for the exchange of prisoners refused to include on the same scale the Russian prisoners taken in Holland who were in the actual services and fought for the sole cause of the English. I had, said the emperor, hit upon the bent of Paul's character. I seized time by the forelock. I collected these Russians. I clothed them and sent them back to him without any expense. From that instant, that generous heart was altogether devoted to me. And as I had no interest in opposition to Russia, I should never have spoken or acted but with justice. There was no doubt but that I should have been enabled for the future to dispose of the cabinet of St. Petersburg. Our enemies were sensible of the danger, and it has been thought that this goodwill of Paul proved fatal to him. It well might have been the cause. For there are cabinets with whom nothing is sacred. It has been already mentioned that the emperor complained that the Prince de Pontecorvo Bernadotte was scarcely in Sweden before he had occasion to distrust and counteract his schemes. The following letter is a decisive proof of this assertion and also contains an important exposition of the continental system. Tuileries, August 8th, 1811. Monsieur le Prince Royal of Sweden, your private correspondence has reached me. I have appreciated as a proof of the sentiments of friendship you entertain for me, and as a testimony of the loyalty of your character, the communications which you make to me. There is no political reason which prevents me from answering you. You appreciate without doubt the motives of my decree of the 21st of November, 1806. It prescribes no laws to Europe. It merely traces the steps that are to be followed to reach the same end. The treaties which I have signed constitute the remainder. The right of blockade which England has arrogated to herself is as injurious to the commerce of Sweden and is hostile to the honor of her flag as it is injurious to the commerce of the French Empire and to the dignity of its power. I will even assert that the domineering pretensions of England are still more offensive with regards to Sweden, for your commerce is more maritime than continental. The real strength of the kingdom of Sweden consists as much in the existence of its navy as in the existence of its army. The development of the forces of France is altogether continental. I have been enabled to create within my states an internal trade which diffuses subsistence and money from the extremities to the center of the empire by the impulse given to agricultural and manufacturing industry and by the rigorous prohibition of foreign productions. The state of things is such that it is impossible for me to decide whether French commerce would have much to gain by peace with England. The maintenance, observance, or adoption of the decree of Berlin is therefore, I am bold enough to say it, more in the interests of Sweden and of Europe than in the particular interests of France. Such are the reasons which my ostensible policy may set up against the ostensible policy of England. The secret reasons that influence England are the following. She does not desire peace. She has rejected all the overtures which I have caused to be made to her. Her commerce and her territory are enlarged by war. She is apprehensive of restitutions. She will not consolidate the new system by a treaty. She does not wish that France should be powerful. I wish for peace. I wish for it in its perfect state, because peace alone can give solidity to new interests and states created by conquest. I think that on this point, your Royal Highness ought not to differ in opinion from me. I have a great number of ships. I have no seamen. I cannot carry on the contest with England for the purpose of compelling her to make peace. Nothing but the continental system can prove successful in this respect. I experience no obstacle on the part of Russia and Prussia. Their commerce can only be a gainer by the prohibitive system. Your cabinet is composed of enlightened men. There is dignity and patriotism in the Swedish nation. The influence of your Royal Highness in the government is generally approved. You will experience few impediments in withdrawing your people from a mercantile submission to a foreign nation. Do not suffer yourself to be caught by the too tempting baits which England may hold out to you. The future will prove to you that whatever may be the revolutions which time must produce, the sovereigns of Europe will establish prohibitive laws which will leave them masters in their own dominions. The third article of the Treaty of the 21st of February, 1802 corrects the incomplete stipulations of the Treaty of Frederickshamn. It must be rigorously observed in every point which relates to colonial commodities. You tell me that you cannot do without these commodities, and that from the want of their introduction, the revenue of your customs is diminished. I will give you 20 millions of colonial productions, which I have at Hamburg. You will give me 20 millions of iron. You will have no specie to export from Sweden. Give up these productions to merchants. They will pay the import duties. You will get rid of your iron. This will answer my purpose. I am not in want of iron at Antwerp, and I know not what to do with the English commodities. Be faithful to the treaty of the 24th of February. Drive the English smugglers from the roads of Gothenburg. Drive them from the coast where they carry on an open trade. I give you my word that I will on my part scrupulously observe the conditions of that treaty. I shall oppose the attempts of your neighbors to appropriate to themselves your continental possessions. If you fail in your engagements, I shall consider myself released from mine. It is my wish to be always on amicable understanding with your Royal Highness. I shall hear with pleasure your communication of this answer to His Swedish Majesty, whose good intentions I have constantly appreciated. My Minister for Foreign Affairs will return an official answer to the last note which the Comte d'Essen has submitted for my perusal. Napoleon the 8th. I went to the Emperor's apartment about 11 o'clock. He was dressing himself and looking over with his valet some samples of perfumery and scents received from England. He inquired about them all, did not know one of them, and laughed heartily at his gross ignorance, as he called it. He wished to breakfast in the tent, and we all assembled there. He complained of the bad quality of the wine and called upon his maitre d'hotel, Cipriani, who is a Corsican, to prove that they had much better in their country. He said he had received as part of his patrimony the first vine in the island in size and productiveness. It was called La Sposata, and he felt it his duty, he said, not to mention it, but with gratitude. It was to that vine that he was indebted in his youth for his visits to Paris. It was that which supplied the expenses of his vacations. We asked him what was to become of it. He told us that he had long ago disposed of it in favor of his nurse, to whom he was convinced he had given about 120,000 francs in lands and houses in the island. He had even resolved to give her his patrimonial house, but finding it too much above her situation, he had made a present of it to the Romolino family, his nearest relatives by his mother's side, on condition that they should transfer their habitation to his nurse. In a word, he said he had made a great lady of her. She had come to Paris at the time of the coronation and had an audience of the Pope for upwards of an hour and a half. Poor Pope, exclaimed the Emperor. He must have had a good deal of spare time. She was, however, extremely devout. Her husband was a coasting trader of the island. She gave great pleasure at the Tuileries and enchanted the family by the vivacity of her language and her gestures. The Empress Josephine made her a present of some diamonds.